Hi everybody, thanks so much. First day of spring in London. I'm afraid if you're looking for royal exclusives, you've come to the wrong place. But thanks very much for joining us. So this is the latest in a series of panels that are going to be held here at the Conduit Club this year, looking at the year of democracy, the year of elections as it's been billed. I think someone said more than 4 billion people get the right to vote this year. Not all those votes will count, but there obviously are some very, very consequential elections. My name's Simon Wilson. I had a 30-year career. I know it doesn't look like it. It couldn't possibly be true. But I was bureau chief at various points in Washington, Jerusalem, and Brussels, which at least gives me some right to ask the questions. But we've got a much smarter panel tonight who are going to provide some of the answers. Many eyes obviously already on Washington for the November presidential election. It looks like Donald Trump and Joe Biden will be the candidates, but these are crazy days, not just in the US but around the world. So I certainly wouldn't rule out any surprises and changes between now and then. Our guide to all things American tonight is Leslie Vinjamuri. I hope I got that right. Leslie is Director of the US and Americas Program at Chatham House and Professor of International Relations at SOAS, part of the University of London. She leads a number of research initiatives on America's global role on the US in international affairs magazines. We'll come to you in a moment, Leslie. Coming up at the end of this month are municipal elections in particularly crucial votes in Ankara and Istanbul, which are currently held by the opposition. So these elections are being seen as a party of President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Any approximation of the? Very good. And he's hinted recently this may be his last as leader. So our guide to Turkey is going to be Alexander Christie-Miller, former Turkey correspondent for the Times newspaper. A fantastic new book, which I've started, and there are copies at the back, called To the City, which blends the narrative of Istanbul and with the stories of some of those who've lived along its ancient walls. So look forward to hearing more about that. And we'll come to you shortly, Alexander. But we're going to start today with our third panelist, Alpa Shah. Alpa is a social anthropologist and writer specializing in South Asia. She is Professor of Anthropology at the London School of Economics and author of the award-winning Night March Among India's Revolutionary Guerrillas, a finalist for the 29 political writing. And a friend of mine who knows a bit about India says it's an incredible book and you're very, very brave. Her latest book, just published last week, is The Incarcerations, in which she charts the collapse, as she sees it, of Indian democracy through the story of the arrests and trial of a group known as the BK-16. Now, we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion tonight, but I'm going to come first to each of the panelists. And Alpa, just tell us first of all, who are the BK-16 and what do you think their case shows about democracy in India today?
Having me and lovely to be in conversation.
Don't forget your microphone.
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Mic. Yeah, no, thanks so much. Yeah, the BK-16, they are professors, lawyers, poets, journalists, trade unionists, and a huge array of people from living in different parts of this great nation, India, working both on the ground, having relationships with very grassroots movements amongst indigenous people, amongst untouchable people, working for the rights of Muslims, India's great big minority, but also very powerful, having voices that can reach international forums. Some of them have been guests of the LSE on a number of occasions. So there are these extraordinary people. I call them custodians of democracy in the book. And what was astonishing was that in 2018, They were picked up by the police of a particular city in India, Pune. Their houses were raided, their computer devices were taken from them, and over the next couple of years, they all found themselves incarcerated in an Indian prison, in Mumbai, and it was said that they were Maoist terrorists, that they were anti-national, that they had been plotting to assassinate Prime Minister Modi, that they had incited riots in this place called Bhima Koregaon, from where the BK acronym emerges, a town in the state of Maharashtra, and myself had not heard about before we came across this case. And so it was an astonishing case. For the time of my interest in this case, you know, what I realized that the 16 and the way in which they were arrested. Later it was found that the evidence that the Pune police found on their computers allegedly was implanted on their computers. So there's this huge kind of cyber warfare which is being used by the Indian state. It seems being used to incarcerate these custodians of democracy. And so my book, I think I found the case really intriguing and the people really intriguing. Why were they so dangerous? And how did this happen? How did we arrive at this situation? And to me is how once amazing experiment in democracy, India, the world's largest democracy, 900 million voters now in the next election, how that whole idea of democracy, which came about in 1910 from British colonial rule, how that idea has completely collapsed, how India has, you know, to use the words of The Economist, sleepwalked into authoritarianism, how, you know, we are seeing in the words of many commentators of fascism, and we see the collapse of democracy through this case. We see it in the judiciary and how the judiciary has been compromised. We see it in how the media has dealt with this case, and so, you know, these are the two, often considered the two last democracy, but of course in entire institutions, in the educational institutions, a slow but a very steady democratic institutions of a country. And so, yeah, I think that what I found really interesting and extraordinary about this case is how it became a window into the collapse of a great democracy, but also a window into what the fight for democracy ought to mean today on the ground, and how the BK16 represented it.
Well, you mentioned there, it's by many measures the world, 900 million, almost 1 billion people get the right to vote in elections starting next month. I think they go on for several weeks. What should we here be looking out for in those elections? So, you know, Prime Minister Modi is the man who's been in power, who presumably you feel has overseen this challenge to democracy. What should we in the West be looking for in these elections, do you think?
Well, I think Prime Minister Modi is presented as the man, you know, who is going to lead these elections, who's slated to win. But what we should be looking out for to structure that lies behind him, that is beyond this, you know, one strong man, and how you know, how blind we are here in the West to the kinds of forms of authoritarianism on the rise, the ways in which there are Modi posters everywhere across the country, which have captured the whole kind of election, you know, people's imagination of, like, there isn't even an alternative being presented to the public. How the complicity also between the regime in power and corporate global capitalism, big large corporations which have given rise to him.
Let's talk a little bit about that, but we'll move on in a moment. But obviously his supporters will point to the economic that's seen, you know, India pull millions and millions of people out of poverty into the middle class. Is there any sort of justification in that for the way that sort of India has developed?
I think, you know, Modi promised in 2014 when he came into power these good days out of calm, and you know, promised the lifting of, you know, loads of people out of poverty. But what has also been shown very starkly is the rising inequality. You know, the fact that 1% of the population owns wealth. If you look at Thomas Piketty's figures, India is now the most unequal country in the world. And whilst, you know, certainly in the places where I've worked as a researcher, very, very poor areas, you can see people's lives are, you know, on the whole better. At the same time, you know, this is an extremely precarious, and there's been a rise of a big middle class. It is an extremely precarious middle class. And I think with that has come with the, you know, Modi didn't deliver the promises. He said he didn't deliver the jobs he said he would deliver. So what we've also seen, especially over the last since the last election, is really the rise of a kind of extreme form of, you know, religious nationalism, which has also captured people's imaginations, and the stripping away of the rights of the Muslim minority, which have which is rise to a kind of Hindu man, an ideal of a Hindu man on the ground, which has captured the Indian imagination, you know, and given new rise of new ideas of virtue, what it means to be a good woman. So economic model, then we need to focus on. We've also got to be focusing on the kind of religious and cultural forms of a whole reshaping of a country.
It's fascinating. I mean, there's so many echoes in all of these elections this year to do with, you know, the harnessing the religious vote and sort of harking back to forward glories that we'll get onto. Thank you. Alexander, let's focus on Turkey for a bit. And again, there are many echoes in ways, you know, big country, a trend towards authoritarianism. Your book specifically looked at Istanbul and some of the citizens there. I think you saw in some of the families you followed that movements that can explain how someone like Erdoğan actually harnesses power and exercises it. So please tell us a bit about what your research showed and how you think that ties in with the upcoming election, which I think is March 31st in Turkey, isn't it? End of this month.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, March 31st. And so, yeah, I mean, with my book, in a way, I didn't set out to investigate the underlying causes of Erdoğan's popularity or whatever fragility may underlie it. I began working on the book a very long time ago in sort of 2015, 2016. And really, it was a book rooted in a place, and that place is the old Byzantine walls of Istanbul. But if there's a theme to the book, it's about how people endure and live through eras of precipitous change. And there are various kinds of change I look at: the environmental change, the change in the urban landscape, the sort of economic difficulties that have been mounting in the country, and of course, one of the big ones is the political change and the rise of authoritarianism. And when I started following these people, it was sort of really almost in reaction to what I'd been doing as a journalist, which was, you talk to people and you talk to, you from various sources, you work out what you think's going on in the country, and then when you write articles, you try to find people who exemplify those. When I started writing this book, it was really, my criteria was that they were people living in those neighborhoods around these very evocative, rundown city walls. I didn't know where their stories would lead. But what was very interesting was that over the course of my time following them, it sort of built up a very much a sort of granular view of both of really why Erdogan's hold has maintained. And the book, I was finishing up the book as those elections, presidential elections, happened last year, and it was striking that a lot of the sort of anti-government people who I'd been following had either fled the country or had been sort of cowed out of being involved in politics because they were worried about their families, they'd started having children, they were facing, judicial harassment, police harassment. But the other thing that was striking was that a lot of the people on the pro-Erdogan side increasingly disillusioned with the state of the country. There's immense dissatisfaction with the economy. Obviously, there was the earthquake last year, and one of the people in my book was very personally affected by that. But it was striking that in spite Erdogan won that re-election, and some of the places where he garnered the strongest support were in these earthquake-hit zones.
What was the issue with the earthquake? Was it the response from the government?
Yes. I mean, the government was widely seen as A, the country adequately for a disaster like that, and B, not having had a particularly good response to it. But what was striking was that even in these areas, the government vote was still very strong. And I think one of the reasons that sort of emerged, people in Turkey now find it very hard to envision anyone else providing the sort of services of government after 20 years of Erdogan's AKP party rule. Even if people are disillusioned, they sort of think, well, no one else is going to be able to do it. It brings me as to why this election at the end of this month is important. When I was asked to join this panel initially, I thought, presidential elections in the US, presidential elections in India, Turkey's presidential elections were last year. But Istanbul particularly has always been incredibly important as a sort of national springboard to as a sort of auditioning role for sort of national leader. That's how it worked for Erdogan. He became mayor in 1994. And the current mayor, who won the municipality in 2019, is from the opposition. He's widely seen as having done a sort of fairly decent popularity. If he's able to eke out a win in fairly unfavourable conditions, it's a sort of a sign that there's possibly other people who can provide leadership in the country, and it'll give a sort of sign of things to come in Turkey.
It's so interesting because there are echoes of all these elections. We just had the election in Russia, or we're kind of in the middle of the election in Russia, but that sense of Putin being so inevitable that people just vote for him because they can't imagine anything else. Is that what you're saying about Erdogan, or hints of that in Turkey?
Well, obviously Turkey's very different. If it was Russia, there'd be no discussion about who was winning the Moscow election. And it's indicative.
Although, to be fair, there was a period in Russia where there were actually independent mayors of cities. It's ancient history now. It's not that long ago. It's incredible how things move.
No, exactly. But it's, I think in Turkey, he obviously tried when İmamoğlu won the municipality in 2019. He forced a rerun of that election, but the response from the electorate was to elect him more emphatically. And so, there are some constraints that the government, I think the Turkish government feels like it's constrained to some degree by the sensibilities of the electorate. But there's definitely, when you of the government's message on the media, in the media and this sort of thing, there's very, very strong pressure for people to stick with the status quo. To give you an example, Erdogan was campaigning on the Black Sea coast recently, and one of the things he mentioned is he said, if we're not in power, there won't be any natural gas anymore through our deals with Russia and so on. If we go, no more natural gas. And that's kind of, that's quite powerful messaging. And in a way, the irony is that as people become poorer and more desperate, and as the economic situation worsens, in some ways that message becomes almost more compelling because people feel, well, we need to cling on to this, otherwise there won't be anything. So yeah, it's sort of interesting the way that seems to be going.
No, it's fascinating, and I hopefully later we'll get time to come back to talk about, I mean, both India and Turkey and their regional roles, because they both have really important. Let's move to the US, because Turkey and India are obviously really big, important countries, but nothing kind of, puts the willies under people than the thought of a US election and it going the way that it may well go. With no, not all of them, some of the polls showing that Trump would beat Biden in November. I mean, I guess the first question is, are we sure it's going to be Trump versus Biden? There's all these legal cases, there are health issues. It seems to be a crazy time in American politics. Leslie, what's your take? Are we looking at Trump Biden, and if so, what should we expect?
I mean, for up until very recently, I was more enthusiastic about making the point that anything could happen, and this is, crystal ball land as opposed to research or analysis. But of course, we know that given the age of both candidates, volatility surrounding one candidate, and given the legal cases, of course we could end up in a different situation. It doesn't seem likely, but I always like to say we didn't predict the end of the Cold War. We didn't predict the financial crisis. We didn't predict 9/11. We didn't predict the election of Donald Trump. So we don't do prediction very well. And that's just in my little patch. Yeah. And, in general, things are very obvious in hindsight. Of course he was never going to make it to the election. 91 criminal charges. How could anybody like that have ever made it to November? But at the moment, it looks like he certainly will. And it looks like they both will. And, in terms of who wins, I mean, that's another kind of crystal ball. And the reason it's crystal ball is important, though, because, we like to look at the polls and everybody obsesses with respect to the media. The media love to zero in on the polls, but polls are really just, a data point of how the people that decided to respond and the method give us some sense of things. And we all know that in the end, an election comes out to who decides to vote. And that is a turnout issue. That is not a polling issue. And so I would argue that the only real data we have isn't very good, because Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot in 22 or 23, but he was there and he didn't do well. He obviously didn't win in 2020. And he's done well in the primaries, which isn't surprising, because in primaries you get voters who are more on the extremes of the party. You have to be pretty committed to come out and vote, even non-committed, on the Democratic side. So there's a lot in there that leads us to believe that even those polls that have showed Trump ahead don't tell us what we need to know. And there's a lot of ground to travel. But I mean, in terms of, it's interesting to listen to the two of you, because I think the question that we asked many of us through the first Trump is, does the system work? Can the institutions of democracy at the national level and at the state level and at the local levels and civil society, can they sustain, and can they push back against and through a period of assault, right? Ongoing attack and assault from the person on Pennsylvania Avenue. And, of course, there were many norms that were eroded. Of course, there was much greater division. Of course, there were numerous setbacks. But the system held. There was an attack. There was an insurrection. There was an attempted coup. People have different views on what happened. At the end of the day, they turned up and they certified the vote. And we had a legally contested election in which there was a peaceful transfer of power. And in 2022, we didn't actually have any violence. And the media thought we'd have all sorts of violence. And so it's very interesting, the dog that didn't bark. So there is room for optimism on the process and on the system. Having said that, clearly the things that if Trump were to be reelected, the broad constituency of conservative individuals and organizations that would like to be part of his journey have a plan. It's called Project 2020. 25. It's publicly available of the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative think tank in Washington that convenes it. Much of it's about foreign policy, much of it's about domestic policy. Some of the people that have contributed are very serious and are putting forward policy positions that are very palatable and certainly worthy of very serious debate by credible people who've had a lifetime working in foreign affairs. And some of them are very concerning. And the one that I would point to is the plan to turn thousands of permanent civil service employees who serve at the will of the elected president in order to put his agenda into place. I think the numbers are as great as 50,000, they might be more. And that is Donald Trump's response to what he believes is the deep state that has taken over much of the American federal civil service and no longer does what it's supposed to do, which is to execute the agenda of the lawfully elected President of the United States of America. So when you listen to the articulation of the justification for doing this, there's a lot to it, right? America constitutionally has 3 branches of government. Why do we have a 4th independent executive branch? And they've lived there in, well, you know the areas, Chevy Chase, Maryland, Virginia, Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. And we need to have more diversity of opinion, except, of course, that when you look at the blueprint for this, people are going to have to be interviewed. And they want to know, what do you read? What ideologies? What texts? What is, what's influencing you? So that's a major project.
Well, this is really interesting because I knew we'd find unexpected ways that these sort of stories overlap tonight. I mean, I think there's a really good point to bring in the others, actually. So when Alpa, in India, for example, I mean, India famously had a bureaucracy bestowed by the British. I mean, it must have been one of the deepest deep states. Has Modi managed to sort of bring that on board? Do the civil servants and the judges and a court of appeal, is that now lined up behind the Prime Minister?
I think he has really tried to take over. Of course, he can't completely, and to change the Supreme Court, how Supreme Court judges were appointed, he wasn't completely able to do that. And right now, a lot of commentators were saying that even the Supreme Court has been, taken over by the Modi government. But just over the last few days, we've seen kind of some astonishing developments. For example,
but some prompted by the release of your book. Potentially.
No, I wish, and I hope that it will have some impact. But no, around how political parties are funded. So the Modi government introduced these electoral bonds, they call them, in 2017, where corporations could anonymously fund political parties through the State Bank of India. And this massive wealth was amassed by the BJP, the Modi's party, so that the last election campaign was like, they spent far more than the US elections. And, so these bonds were anonymous, so corporations were that gave them, but the BJP knew because they control the State Bank of India, so they could put all kinds of pressures on those donors to, all kinds of kickbacks. So it was it was a process of reciprocity, and looking at the COVID vaccine, who got it? Get it after this huge donation? Yes, they did. So it's lots and lots. All this data is just coming out over the last few days, and it's coming out because the Supreme Court declared that this was unconstitutional. Of course, it's not going to impact the next elections because the party's already been funded. So it's interesting. There are certain places where the Supreme Court is holding fort, is fighting back, but on other crucial issues like temple in the city of Ayodhya, on the grounds of a mosque, the Supreme Court has just bowed down,
And Alexander, what about in Turkey? If we're talking about, the judiciary, the civil service, how has that survived the years of Erdogan?
Well, in Turkey, it's been, relatively speaking, quite easy for him to change the country's constitutional arrangements because he's been able to do it by a simple referendum, which he's done a couple of times, and he's popular enough to secure a majority, of more than 50% for those votes. So, I mean, he's had a slight problem in that the Constitutional Court, which he kind of engineered a few years ago, has subsequently proved slightly too independent for him, and so it's in the process of being, or either has just been done again. So, in that sense, he's been very successful. I think the key thing in Turkey is that certainly in the early years of his government, his party didn't have the kind of bureaucratic and institutional muscle to populate all the different ministries and arms of the state in the way that he needed. In Turkey, there's this thing, the process of populating a ministry with your followers actually has its own word, kadrolaşma, and so people have been doing it for years and years. They were no good about that. He had this huge electoral support, but he didn't have the kind of organizational, force of people of the appropriate educational level to be able to get into these ministries and run them. And the same with the judiciary. And so he had this alliance with this religious movement, the Gülen movement, which did have that. And so that was really, they gave him his route into, it was obviously initially, it was the, very much secularist dominated, Kemalist dominated, the sort of followers of Ataturk. Yeah. And so the Gülen movement, they had a big fight, and they fell out, and then the Gülenists were purged. And since then, he's been tapping other allies, other right-wing movements, religious movements. One of the main right-wing parties, the MHP, it's called. Really, it's kind of an ongoing process, and it's one where he's, been fairly successful at it, and he's made himself very much personally at the centre of all this. But how durable that will be in the long term, I think, remains to be seen.
Leslie, I want to come back to talk about Trump, who is fascinating in so many ways. One of the big contrasts with the other two leaders that we're talking about, I mean, they do have their hands on the levers of power. I mean, he really has years, and yet he still seems to be able to drive the narrative, drive the debate. How does he do it? You sort of hinted that, that there are groups sort of allied behind him who will come on board if he wins power again. But what is it about Trump and the people around him that seem to be able to sort of drive the narrative of US politics?
I mean, I'm not so sure that he is. I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate, because he would want me to overstate. But he's clearly had, I mean, your question is a good one. He's clearly had considerable influence, especially over the Republican Party, into something that it really never was. It was a internationalist, pro-trade, anti-Russia, it was the Cold War party. And it's none of those things anymore. And he's also, to your point, he's really has a lock and a grip on the narrative that defines that party, not only make America great again, but also the Chinese, the Germans, the Washingtonians are the problem, and you deserve better, right? He knows how to deliver that message to people, despite the fact that he's, only been unofficially the head of the Republican Party for these 4 years. And that's where I think it's quite extraordinary that he's maintained that grip. And he does it, he does it in ways that I think many of us recognize to be very, very intuitive for a lot of Americans. And I think, you've lived in America for many years. You kind of understand, if you leave Washington, you quickly understand that he just knows how to talk to people. And the fact that he cuts out the middleman, yes, he uses the media, yes, he uses social media, but he's really a direct communicator. He loves those rallies. That is where he really comes into, to me, oh, let's invite him to Chatham House. And I was like, sure, he's never going to say yes. This is not what gets him going, right? An elite, self-selected audience in, St. James's Square, not big enough playing field. So I think that he communicates and he uses all sorts of signs that take you right into everyday culture and life in local cities and towns across the United States. So he's very effective. But, let's put it in perspective. This is a man who lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. All sorts of people that aren't supportive of him, even in the Republican Party, but are concerned and scared, quite frankly, to vote against him, to vote against the party, which is, in the background there he sits, partly because more popular with their local electorates than they are. And so there's partly a calculation there electorally that's really been important, especially in Congress, in the House. But partly because of the fear of sanction, and that questions about, quite frankly, violence, but also sanction from the party. And so a lot of people have just simply had to make a choice. And, the Republican Party has gotten smaller also. So I still think if you come back to that basic question, I think there is a difference. I am actually on the US in the medium term. And this really scary part is in order to get to the medium term, we do have to get to what you alluded to, which is this transition. Regardless of the result, you have to get from November to January 20th. And we now know it could play out if Biden's elected with a contested election, possibly with violence, with all sorts of challenges. And, if Trump is elected, then we're in a very, very different domain.
Alpa.
Yeah, sorry, so many things you said which just rang true, of what's happening in India and Modi especially. And I remember my book, the introduction starts with this great bear hug that Modi and Trump had in Houston in 2019 in this huge stadium, and Howdy Modi. It was called the Howdy Modi event, this idea of, let's make the US great again, let's make India great again. We've been on 1,000 years of colonization. We are going to restore its ancient history, civilization, and we are not only an amazing Hindu nation, we are the mother of democracy. No longer displacing the Greek idea. Greece. These are the claims that are being made, and the creation of an internal enemy or an external and an internal enemy. Well, Pakistan is always that, of course, but the internal enemy, the Muslim other, the playing on that, so many kind of similarities. But there's one difference which makes me much less hopeful of what is happening in India than you are of the US, and that is that behind Modi is this 100-year-old organization of a family of organizations called the Sangh Parivar, the family of the Hindu right, which includes a military wing, the RSS, which includes trade unions, which includes student movements in all the university campuses, the ABVP, and which includes farmers' movements, and which includes the building of, loads of schools across the nation, loads of health clinics across the nation, which includes the diaspora. There is huge organization here in the UK, in the US, and this organization, slow work that they have been doing to change the idea of what India should be, the imagination of a country, a Hindu nation, that is I think very different. And it's not just Modi. It is a whole infrastructure, and that has been at this slowly for 100 years.
It's fascinating. I should say, by the way, so we've got about 30 minutes to go, and I'm going come to at least 15, 20 minutes of interesting questions in your head. Please formulate them, and I will call as many of you as possible. One area that I wanted to hear from each of you on, actually, because I think it's fascinating, which is sort of harnessing religion as part of a sort of political movement, which, you know, in some ways, each of these three leaders we've been talking about have done. I mean, Alexander, maybe start in Turkey, because of course, you know, it was the secular country in the Middle East, wasn't it? I mean, that was the whole thing under Ataturk. It was a secular Muslim country. If that's not a contradiction in terms, but how has Erdoğan harnessed, you know, religion in his political rise?
Well, I mean, there's a very sort of deep background to that, in the sense that, you know, the secular Turkish state as founded by Ataturk was very much out of step with the majority of the Turkish population at the time. You know, he imposed this you know, very radical form of secularism, you know, sort of in the form, you know, through a dictatorship effectively, and the history of democratic Turkey since the first free elections in 1950, stop-start history of the rolling back of the kind of very radical secularist vision which Ataturk had. You know, what's really extraordinary about Erdoğan is that up until you know, his rise, really, there was you know, this was expressed through the sort of secular right wing, and the Islamists, you know, the Islamists were sort of banned fringe, and really over Erdoğan's time, they've come up to completely dominate the right, and so when initially there was very much this sense, you know, I think both in Washington and Europe and all around the place, that he was not so much imposing religious values as you know, enshrining religious freedoms, and he would do this thing which he still does, of saying, like, we're not opening mosques, we're restoring old churches, we're restoring synagogues and that sort of thing. And to some degree, it's kind of it's like window dressing, but this is what, you know, he's always claimed. What's interesting now is that, you know, I think I'd be very interested to know what the case is in the US and India, but I don't really think the Turkish population is becoming more religious. You know, if anything, I think it's the opposite. I think that you know, the technological changes around the world over the last sort of 2 decades, and you know, various factors are making particularly younger people, you know, less likely to subscribe to organised religion. I think his success in exploiting of that, and he's exploiting the anxiety of other generations. But what's happening now in Turkey is that you have a situation where, you know, arguably the population is less religious, but as he's increasingly reliant on wing segments of you know, in his political coalition, if anything, he's pushing further down the sort of religious direction. At the moment, there's this thing where they're trying to change the alimony laws, you know, less in favour of women, which is generating sort of substantial unease even within his own constituency, and so see how that plays out. And I'd be interested to know as well, you know, this idea of, you know, why the religious appeal is sort of working in other countries or not.
We could just hear your thoughts on sort of religion in American politics, because we hear a lot about evangelist Christians, and, you know, does Trump appeal to them or appall them? I think I'm right in hearing, in saying that I heard Trump the other day saying that any Democrat is renouncing Israel. I mean, I think he said that. It's possible. Yeah. How do you think religion, I mean, if it does play out in this coming election, is it important?
I mean, religion is always important in the US, because there are always debates about religion in schools, the curriculum, the freedom of expression, as you know, religion is, I mean, it's the foundation, right? That freedom of expression, and a big part of it's about religion. So it's always there. I think politically, we know that Donald Trump's base, that the evangelical Christian base is critically important to that. And I would like to say, I think sometimes when we're outside of the US or even in Washington or California, we go, oh, evangelical Christians. I have two sisters who are, I think technically we don't talk about this, but they're evangelical Christians. But you know, they're normal people. One is a teacher, one is a medical doctor. They have, but we do tend to kind of categorize people in a way that sort of, we do it too, okay? These are very well educated, intelligent women in their 40s who have high-functioning careers, high-functioning families, and live a very normal life, and they're not out trying to convert people. But there are a lot of people who really hold on to traditional values, and a lot of them are only evangelical Christians. So I think that Donald Trump appeals to a base of voters, and it's very bizarre, given the hush money, you know, the extra merit, none of his personal values are there, but he's managed politically to get a lockhold on a certain community that, and once you're in a community, then you sort of, you know, people vote in their communities. And so a lot of, it's a very complicated story. So I'm a little bit reluctant to kind of people who vote for Donald Trump. But he has a lock on the evangelical Christian base for sure. And he also, and you know, America's partly, the religious base of America is sustained by something that's historically been a very good thing for the United States, which is immigration. And a lot of immigrants, conservative, they're not necessarily Christian, but they like that conservative base of values is really very important. And I think it's part of the reason that we're seeing some you know, movement across certain demographics that we've thought would be Democrat moving to the Republican side of the aisle. So it's a very complicated story, but he's, you know, in this sense, he's politically intelligent about gaining hold of that base. And he also, you know, the foreign policy that he articulates in part is there to serve that base, and the support, the very clear support for Israel, the moving the embassy, you know, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was, you know, a signaling device for his base. But, you know, to be clear and to hold ourselves accountable, wealthy Americans promised tax cuts. Corporate America promised tax cuts. And oil and gas promised drilling. It takes a lot of people to get to 70 million, and guess what? They're not all evangelical Christians who are crazy. So I do think we need to be a little bit, you know, careful not to make it all about religion in the U.S. context. It's far more complex, and there is a really significant contest going on in the United States that's arguably more important, which is the proper role of the state in the economy. And it's been, you know, free market economics and freedom in general has been so important for Americans' and that history. And so, you know, what Biden's trying to do to, like, you know, introduce the role of the state through the Inflation Reduction Act, through export controls on semiconductor chips and component parts to China, through the whole foreign economic and domestic economic, is not one that a lot of people like, and especially a lot of our friends. So it's not just them, it's us. And that's part of the genius of Donald Trump, is he manages to speak to his rich friends and donors, and he also manages to speak to a very, actually don't like the rich friends, and he's managed to knit it together. It's political brilliance in a very, very toxic, narcissistic, dangerous individual.
Alpa, just whilst we're on religion, you've mentioned the kind of, you know, this sort of Hindu establishment behind Modi. Obviously, there are huge minorities. It's such a big country. There are huge minorities: Muslims, Christians, Sikhs. How are those communities feeling ahead of an election like this?
Oh, I don't know how they're feeling ahead of an elections like this. But I mean, one of the things that Modi has to do is that, yes, the 200 million Muslims are being included in unequal terms, right? There's a stripping away of the Muslim autonomy of the one Muslim majority region, Kashmir. There's new citizenship are exclude Muslims. The others, they're all okay as long as they adhere to our form of Hinduism. As long as, lots of Christian, Adivasis, indigenous people I worked with, Christian Dalits, Ghar wapas, come back home, is the message to them, come back to Hinduism. So you can be included, you're fine, but as long as and it's a very exclusionary idea of Hinduism. India is a huge, diverse nation, set up as a secular nation, and Hinduism was very syncretic, exists in many, many, many, many different forms. Differences between Islam and Hinduism on the ground are often, it's just porous. But what is being crystallized now is an idea of Hinduism, which I think the vision of the RSS was, we need Hinduism that is like Christianity, that is like Islam, that has the book, that has, a kind of capital R. And that's what they've said about instituting. And, Modi himself is now presenting himself as the god, Ram, that's how he presented himself as, resurrecting this temple in Ayodhya. So it's a very, very, it's different to the United States, a very close relationship between religion and what the nation state is and represents, and very clear ideas of who is excluded from that vision.
Very different again from Turkey as well.
I mean, it's been fascinating. Let's try and take some questions. So if you put your hands up, and I'll try and call you, and if you can just say your name and if there's anything relevant about somewhere you were in there with the moustache. I'll do my best question time summary.
Hi, I'm Islamic and a keen Turkey watcher. I think I shared the same surprise as you did maybe at the election, that how the economy didn't really affect a country that has 180% inflation maybe, and but still got along so much support, even if given all the caveats about Turkish elections. And it also touched on what you were saying, that in America there's a lot of hand-wringing quite well, but it doesn't really seem to be translating into support for Biden. So I was wanting to ask, in these kind of environments where institutions are under attack, some strident nationalism, very polarized society, obviously this is in some way about how people vote, but it must have changed in some way. My inner teenage Marxist was like very, very surprised at what happened in Turkey. And I'd just like to hear your opinions on that.
Alexander, do you want to?
Well, I mean, to sort of expand on, what I said earlier, I think that, I mean, it was a surprise to me too. I think that to some degree there is this idea that things might be bad in Turkey. They can look on, Turks can look at the world stage, and they can see that Turkey has become this big regional power, and there's a strong military, there's a domestic arms industry. Erdoğan is someone. I mean, one of the people in my book sort of said she thinks when people go to the polls, at the end of the day, they're going to sit down and think about who they want sitting oppositions, and Erdoğan is always going to be that person. So I think that in the sort of political circumstances in Turkey, there are definitely I think we know fairly conclusively that there are factors that trump economics at the moment, because people are suffering enormously, and people are very unhappy, I think, with the AKP, with Erdoğan's party, but he himself remains this enormously popular and talismanic figure within the very large section of the population that supports him. It was what you're saying about Trump and his ability to connect with ordinary people. Erdoğan has that in the Turkish context. He's enormously divisive, but he's also he's phenomenally charismatic, and you know, what he also has, which I'm not sure if Trump does has, he's got, you know, he's phenomenally pragmatic and canny, and has been able to sort of, you know, preserve his hold on power for a long time. So yeah, I don't know if it carries across to the same reason why, you know, Biden isn't getting economic credit in the US, but I think in Turkey it's certainly, there's some degree to which people have decided that they're willing to accept economic pain to some degree if, you know, Turkey is a big presence on the world stage and that they're being protected from something worse, I guess.
It's Leslie, it's the economy stupid, isn't it? In America, as someone once said.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it is normally the economy as the top issue, and it is translating differently. Delay in terms of how people are experiencing the economy. If you're talking about the kind of class American that should be benefiting, but it's not. It hasn't all filtered through. It's very complex, this question. But the data show that, you know, that they filtered through. At the same time, it's also showing that part of the reason the economy is doing well is because consumer demand is still high because the money that they got in the COVID payments are kind of still in their pocketbook. So it's extremely complex, I think. But, you know, at a general level, I would say that a lot of people give Trump on the economy because it was doing very well until the pandemic. And they you know, they attribute the economic problems to, some of them, to democratic states that locked down too much during COVID. So there's a lot of divisiveness over the response to COVID, and a lot of Trump supporters blame the Democrats for having bad policies that created problems, and then they blame Biden, rather than crediting Biden with where the economy is now, they blame him for how long it took, because they say he spent too much, inflationary policies, and then you get into the state and the economy and the IRA. So it's really, it is very complicated. But I do think a lot of it's how do we like people? Do we like him and do we like him?
Take another question. What have we got? Yeah, gentleman over there. Oh, sorry.
We've heard about in India and in Turkey and in Russia, a strong president using the judiciary to lock up his or her opponents. Do you see in Biden the same behaviour with using the judiciary to try and humble Trump and stopping him from winning?
Interesting. Do you?
No. No, I mean, I don't think that Biden is controlling what the courts are doing. I don't think he's, I mean, if he was doing that, he's doing a very bad job. So, no, I don't. It's a good question.
Yeah, just gentleman here, yeah. And then we'll go over there, yeah.
Hi, Piotr, part of the Blob in DC, about 5 years. Previously you in World Bank, but yeah, I very much lead. I appreciated your comment about we don't also do the same as well, but I have a question. I kind of want to bring all of your thoughts in, because I do podcasting a lot on things like this, and did an episode with Charles Dunce of, I think he's with CSIS at the moment, about strongmen. And I think that there's a running theme here, which is democratic backsliding, centralization of power, strongmen. And Trump wants to achieve what is in Turkey, and obviously Putin is arguably the original strongman of our age. Do you not think that there's a part here that is Western arrogance, and I'm being devil's advocate with this, in that, say, for the Congress Party, when I've spoken to people about why do people love Modi as much as they do? Because he represents something that they think the Congress Party and others are out of touch with. Turkey, I forget the name of the candidate who ran against him. You know, he's academic, he's a great man, but he's not as relatable as Erdoğan. And then obviously Mr. Trump, with his very unique skill set, shall we say, and his ability to appeal to certain people and, as you say, weaponize the existing intellectualism and foreign policy, particularly of the West and so on. So just curious what your thoughts are about Western needs for us to get more in touch with people who feel out of kilter with the existing political system.
It's a good thought. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask you for brief answers. If that's no, let's have all three, but to try and do it briefly. So, Alpa,
Yeah,
brief
I'm
thoughts on
really,
that.
you brought this up, and I just wanted to relate back to something that Leslie had said earlier, which is how Modi has really appealed to anti-establishment, you know, being from the masses, coming up, you know, from the son of a chaiwala, not the elite of the Congress party. But I think the things that I was trying to say earlier is that, yes, the strongman thing is important, but as important is the party and the organization behind Modi, which, you know, the Congress has completely failed at in recent times. So, yeah.
Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, if I interpret your question correctly, I mean, that there's a tendency sometimes, I think, in the West to sort of see Erdogan or Trump or Modi supporters as kind of people who are wowed by a sort of powerful guy type thing. But I mean, certainly in Turkey, there are and there were in the past very strong you know, economic and social reasons why people were supporting him and why he's been successful, you know, which I sort of get into in my book a bit. So yeah, I think it's always very important to kind of even if you're critical of these movements, to be kind of very much human and sympathetic to the people who are supporting them, if I've interpreted what you're saying.
Leslie?
I completely agree that there is something that elites in, like you and me, I guess, in Washington and London and New York are out of touch and perceived to be really out of touch and patronizing. And yeah, the power is seen to be in the wrong place and unfairly. And the ability of Trump to speak to that, but not only Trump, right? But his ability to unlock it. Even for those people that don't, this is even the people that really actually don't like Trump and they would like him to go away, Washington or Biden or the Democrats, they also think the Democrats they don't want the Democrats, right? So they're lost.
Yeah.
They don't really have a good alternative.
I'll just add 2 words to that as well. Boris Johnson. Lady at the back. All questions are welcome, as long as they're short.
Trump, our friend Trump. I appreciate your comment about Washington. You need to get out of Washington to really understand it. From a legal perspective, do you know how the charges against him haven't, you know, he hasn't gone to court before the election? How, if he can still go, what happens if he gets to power and then he can just drop it? Do you know what the legal barriers are or aren't? Is that short?
Excellent question. Thank you.
It's a can of worms, but I think the most likely scenario now is that he just continues to appeal the various cases and use other mechanisms to kick the can down the road with the hope that he is elected and inaugurated is really key here. Not just, I mean, if he was elected but not inaugurated, whoa, another liminal space. But it's true, right? And so there are a lot of, it's kind of like Trump won. There are a lot of things that we're not quite sure, but watch the Supreme Court decision on immunity. That will be they rule as I think we all expect, but who knows, that presidents are not immune, then at least legally he doesn't have the basis for getting rid of the cases. But, you know, he's going to have his hand on a lot of power. And boy, people, including me, are going to be quite nervous if he's elected, because we've said things, we've done things, and can you imagine being in power or a judge or whatever and trying to take this forward when the man is in the White House? It's really very, very scary. Yeah.
Alexander,
So I'm sorry to ask a question. It's a burning one for you. I mean, you know, in Turkey and in India, obviously this process of, you know, the decay of democracy is quite advanced. It seems to me, you know, with Trump, I mean, the institutional constraints, there are some sort of hard institutional constraints. I mean, he'll be a second-term president. You know, even if he wins, you know, the Trump story is over in 5 years' time, one way or another.
That's my view. I do think that I do think we all need to be thinking a lot harder about 2028. Because we're not preparing that. We're so fixed on the current moment. And it won't be Biden, it won't be Trump, it will be something very different. There might, if Trump's elected, there might be a struggle for, you know, Trump trying to maybe get rid of, you know, I don't know. But I don't think he'll win. I think civil society in the United States is phenomenally robust, and people would fight. People would fight if they had to fight for it. I think, how many people in this room are American and would fight for it if they had to? Yeah, I think, or how many people, I won't ask, are American and wouldn't fight for it? I won't ask.
Got a microphone. Here we go. Did you have a question as well? Yeah.
The question, and what we haven't really discussed, which I think is really important when we talk about where the trend is for the far right on the global stage, but as importantly, as an American that has studied the Constitution, there is a separation of state and religion. It's a basis that the forefathers that wrote it in many moons ago. And I think, and I'd love to have your view, back in the day when there were separations of the executive and legislature and judicial part, judges for the Supreme Court got a lifetime. That was back then in 1778 when the life expectancy years. I just thought I would pass that little bomb down that I think, having studied the Constitution on many different levels, we should reconsider, just the way we've had all sorts of amendments in the United States, that maybe we have a term of 12 years because people are living till they're 105 and 110, and someone like Musk, who is doing investigations to live forever, that we should rethink that, and to remind Americans we do have a separation of state and religion. Supreme Court today had 3 candidates, there are 3 judges that were appointed by Trump. God help us.
Okay. Did you want to have a quick thought on that?
I think it's worth, there's a podcast, I've forgotten where it was, maybe Just Security, that Sam Moyn, law professor at Yale, and it was fascinating to listen. It was on one of these, it was on the decision about whether Trump would be kept on the ballot in Colorado, so it's about a month old. And he said something in there, he said, I don't know, like having a constitution isn't necessarily a good thing. But he was actually very serious. Like, we're addicted to this idea of a constitution that locks us into these arcane things that you're absolutely right. Why in the world? I don't know if it's actually in the Constitution. I don't think the Constitution mandates term life appointments, but many things flow from the Constitution.
The irony being that the UK doesn't even have one.
Well, there's something to that, right? I mean, but there's something to democracy has to update itself, not according to an original.
Well,
text.
my little contribution as someone who's lived in many different parts of the world actually is that it's great to have a constitution, because if you haven't got one, the person in power, often the man in power, and that's the problem. And if you start changing it, the person after you changed it again. Anyway, look, it's been
guns in America,
and we're not even
great
going
constitution.
there. Listen, thank you very much for the question, but particularly just please everyone thank the panel for what's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.